In a climate-controlled vault beneath the British Museum, there sits a fragment of baked clay no larger than your palm. The tablet is catalogued as part of the BTM series collection. Its surface is covered in wedge-shaped impressions pressed into the clay more than 2,000 years ago. The cuneiform signs are still sharp, still legible. The tablet is cool to the touch, dense, surprisingly heavy for its size. What makes this particular piece of clay remarkable is not its age, not even the language inscribed upon it. What makes it remarkable is what it records. 7 names, 7 beings, 7 teachers sent before the floodwaters rose. The tablet calls them the Apkallu. The text states they came from the god Enki. It says they taught humanity everything that separates civilization from chaos: writing, mathematics, law, architecture, agriculture, medicine. The text does not present this as metaphor, it presents it as record. The inscription reads, Oannes, who completed the plans of heaven and earth, Oannes, who is given broad understanding, Enmeduga, to whom a good fate is decreed, Enmegalama, who was born in a house, Enmeboluga, who grew up on a river flat, and Enlilda, the purification priest from Eridu, Abzu, who ascended to heaven, 7 names, 7 sages, all before the waters came. The tablet was copied and recopied across centuries. The text appears in multiple versions. In Babylonian, in Assyrian, fragments have been found in different cities, different libraries, different time periods. The names remain consistent. The sequence stays the same. The story does not change. These were not gods. The texts are clear about that. They were messengers, intermediaries, servants of Enki, the god who chose to remember humanity when others chose to forget. This is not a story about ancient astronauts. It is not a story built from misunderstanding or modern fantasy. It is a story the Sumerians and their successors told themselves for thousands of years. They carved it into palace walls. They buried protective images of these beings beneath their homes. They invoked their names in rituals. They attributed the foundations of their entire civilization to these 7 teachers who came from water and returned to it. The question is not whether the Sumerians believed this. The archaeological record makes that clear. They believed it. They documented it with the same care they documented their kings, their battles, their temple construction, their flood. The question is what they were remembering. Before we continue, take a moment if you'd like. Comment where you're listening from, what time it is where you are. This is a long exploration. It requires patience. It asks questions that have no easy resolution. But the texts exist. The tablets are real. The names are preserved. And somewhere in the repetition across centuries, in the consistency across cities, in the careful transmission from scribe to scribe, something waits to be understood. Let the evidence unfold slowly. Before the kingdoms rose, the delta between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers has been inhabited for more than 7,000 years. The archaeological layers tell a story of continuous occupation, continuous adaptation, continuous memory. But one site stands apart. One location appears again and again in Sumerian texts as the first place, the beginning point, the city where order emerged from water. Eridu. The name appears in the Sumerian king list as the first city to receive kingship after it descended from heaven. It appears in religious texts as the dwelling place of Enki, the god of fresh water, wisdom and craft. It appears in flood narratives as the city whose priest-king received warning before the waters rose. Every reference to Eridu carries the weight of deep time, of something that came before everything else. In 1946, Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar began excavations at Tel Abu Sharain in southern Iraq, the site identified as ancient Eridu. What the team discovered confirmed what the texts had suggested. Eridu was not simply old, it was foundational. The excavations revealed 18 distinct building levels, one constructed atop another, spanning millennia. The lowest levels dated to approximately 5400 BC during the Ubaid period. At that time, Eridu would have sat near the shore of the Persian Gulf. The waters have since receded, but in antiquity this was a place where river met sea, where fresh water and salt water converged. Each of the 18 levels contained the remains of a temple, not houses, not fortifications, temples, all dedicated to the same deity across thousands of years. The earliest structure was a simple room, roughly 12 by 15 feet, with an altar or offering table. Over centuries, each temple grew larger, more elaborate, more carefully aligned. But the location never changed. The dedication never changed. Generation after generation rebuilt in the same sacred space, maintaining an unbroken line of worship to Enki, god of the subterranean freshwater ocean, called the Abzu. The Sumerians did not call themselves Sumerians. That is a later designation. They called their land Kengir. The people who inhabited the southern alluvial plain developed the first writing system around 3400 BC, pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay. The earliest tablets record not literature or myth, but administrative details, grain allotments, temple inventories, names of workers. It was a system created to track the movement of goods in an increasingly complex society. But alongside this bureaucratic innovation, the Sumerians developed something else, a literature of memory, stories and king lists and genealogies that reached back beyond the invention of writing itself. These texts attempted to answer a fundamental question. Where did this all come from? How did we learn to organise cities, to build canals, to measure fields, to record agreements, to heal the sick, to read the heavens? The Sumerian king list provides one answer. Kingship descended from heaven. It was given, not invented. The list begins with 8 kings who reigned before the flood. Their reign lengths measured not in human years, but in cosmic time, tens of thousands of years each. Then the text states simply, the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kesh. There is a deliberate structure here. Before the flood, something existed that no longer exists afterward. A mode of kingship, a quality of time, a proximity to divine instruction. The flood marks an ending. What comes after must be rebuilt, relearned, remembered. Eridu appears in another category of Sumerian literature that addresses this same rupture. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on a single tablet from around 1600 BC, describes the creation of humanity, the establishment of the first cities, and the decision by the gods to send the flood. The text is fragmentary, but what remains shows Eridu occupying the central position in both creation and preservation. Humanity is fashioned to serve the gods. Cities are founded, kingship is instituted, but something goes wrong. The text suggests overpopulation, excessive noise, some disruption of cosmic order. The gods decide to erase what they have made, all except one god. Enki, the lord of Eridu, the god dwelling in the subterranean waters, refuses to let humanity be completely destroyed. He warns Ziusudra, the priest-king of Eridu, to build a boat. The flood comes, 7 days and nights. When the waters recede, Ziusudra makes offerings. The gods, smelling the sacrifice, realize they still need humanity. An agreement is reached. There will be no more total annihilation. Life will continue, but it will be bounded by death, thinned by disease, regulated by sterility among some women. This pattern appears across multiple Mesopotamian flood accounts. The Atrahasis epic, dating to the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BC, tells the same essential story with different details. Enlil, the chief executive god, grows angry at human noise and orders their destruction. Enki, defying the divine council, warns Atrahasis to build a boat. The flood comes. When Enlil discovers that humans survived, he is furious. Enki defends his action. The gods come to terms. Humanity continues, but under new limitations. What these texts share is not just the flood itself, but the role of Enki as preserver and teacher. He is characterized consistently as the god who holds secret knowledge, who understands the deep patterns of creation, who values humanity enough to intervene on their behalf. The Sumerians depicted him as a figure seated in flowing waters, streams pouring from his shoulders, fish swimming around him. He is the god of the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, source of rivers, source of springs, source of life in an arid land. And the texts state clearly that Enki did not preserve humanity in isolation. He sent teachers, intermediaries who carried his knowledge from the realm of the gods to the realm of human beings. The BTM Seri ritual text calls them Apkallu. It lists 7 by name. It specifies that they appeared before the flood. It says they were born in the river, that they came from water. Eridu, where river meets sea, where Enki dwells, where kingship first descended, where the priest-king received warning of the flood. This is where the texts place the beginning, not metaphorically, geographically. The oldest continuously inhabited temple site in Mesopotamia, dedicated to the god who sent 7 sages to teach civilization before the waters rose. The texts do not present this as invention, they present it as inheritance. Knowledge given, wisdom transmitted, civilization as something bestowed, then maintained, then nearly lost, then carefully restored. The Sumerians understood themselves as the inheritors of something older than their written records, something preserved from before the flood. What that means depends on what the flood was. A local catastrophe, a cultural memory of rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, a metaphor for social collapse. The answer changes depending on interpretation, but the structure of the story remains consistent. Before the flood, teachers came. They established order. They gave knowledge. Then the waters swept everything away, and what came after had to rebuild from what had been remembered. Eridu stands at the centre of that memory, and Enki, dwelling in the waters beneath Eridu, stands as the one who chose not to forget, the god who remembered humans. The gods of ancient Mesopotamia were not benevolent. This is important to understand. They were powerful, they were capricious, they demanded service, and they displayed a consistent willingness to destroy what they had created. Humanity, in the Mesopotamian worldview, existed as a solution to a divine labour problem. The gods grew tired of digging canals, maintaining irrigation, providing their own food. So they fashioned human beings from clay and divine blood to perform these tasks in their place. The Atrahasis epic makes this explicit. The lesser gods, the Igigi, rebel against their labour. They burn their tools and surround the house of Enlil, the chief god. Enlil calls a divine council. How should they respond to this uprising? Enki suggests a solution. Create a substitute workforce. Fashion human beings to bear the yoke the Igigi refuse to carry. The goddess Nintu mixes clay with the blood of a slaughtered god, and from this mixture humanity is moulded. 7 male and 7 female forms. They are given life for one purpose, to serve. For a time, the arrangement works. Humans multiply. They dig the canals, they maintain the temples, they provide offerings, but they also grow numerous. The texts describe the earth becoming full, humanity spreading, the noise of their activity disturbing the gods. Enlil cannot sleep. The clamour rises. He decides to thin the human population, first through plague. When that fails, through drought. When that fails, through famine. Each time Enki intervenes, teaching humans how to survive, how to appease the specific god causing the disaster, how to restore balance. Finally, Enlil loses patience. He proposes total solution, a flood, complete eradication. The divine council swears an oath. None of them will warn humanity. This time, the destruction will be absolute. Enki does not break the oath directly. He does not speak to Atrahasis. Instead, he speaks to the wall of a reed house, knowing Atrahasis is on the other side, knowing the man will hear. Build a boat. The wall is told. Specific dimensions are given. Bring aboard the animals. Seal the door with pitch. The flood is coming. Atrahasis obeys. The boat is built. The rains arrive. For 7 days and 7 nights, water covers the earth. The gods themselves are terrified by what they have unleashed. The text describes them cowering, weeping, regretting the oath they swore. When the waters finally recede, Atrahasis opens the door and makes an offering. The gods, who have been without food and drink during the deluge, smell the sacrifice. They gather around it like flies, desperate, hungry, and Lil arrives and sees the boat. He sees that humanity has survived. His rage is immediate. We, the great Anunar, all of us, agreed together on an oath. No form of life should have escaped. How did any man survive the catastrophe? Enki responds calmly, I did it in defiance of you. I made sure life was preserved. The confrontation that follows is telling. Enki does not apologize. He does not beg forgiveness. Instead, he lectures Enlil on proportion. If the gods find humanity troublesome, use limited measures. Send lions, send wolves, send famine, send plague. Do not obliterate everything. The cosmos needs humanity. The temples need maintenance. The offerings need to be made. Total destruction serves no one, not even the gods. Enlil concedes. A compromise is reached. Humanity will continue, but its numbers will be regulated. Some women will be barren. Some infants will die. Demons will take children at birth. The human lifespan will be shortened. Death itself becomes the regulating mechanism, ensuring that humanity never again grows numerous enough to disturb divine rest. This is not a story of divine love. It is a story of divine self-interest, tempered by one god's recognition that the created beings have value beyond their labour. Enki is not sentimental. He is pragmatic, and he is curious. The texts repeatedly characterize him as the god of wisdom, of craft, of secret knowledge. He understands things the other gods do not. He sees patterns. He solves problems. And he seems to regard humanity not merely as tools, but as participants in the cosmic order. The Sumerian name Enki means Lord of the Earth, though it can also be read as Lord of the Foundation. His Akkadian counterpart, E, bears a name that may derive from a word meaning house or water. He dwells in the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean. In Sumerian cosmology, this is not simply an underground sea. It is the source. Rivers flow from it. Springs emerge from it. It is the realm of secrets, of origins, of the patterns beneath the surface of things. Enki is credited with organizing the earth after creation, assigning functions to rivers and mountains, establishing boundaries between lands, determining the duties of gods and the natures of animals. The text called Enki and the World Order describes him travelling the earth, setting everything in its proper place, not creating but arranging, not inventing but structuring what already exists into a functioning cosmos. This characteristic appears again and again. Enki is the organizer, the systematizer, the one who takes raw materials and shapes them into order. And the text suggests he extended this same impulse to humanity. Not content merely to preserve human life, he chose to instruct it, to give pattern and structure to human knowledge, just as he gave pattern and structure to the physical world. The early dynastic royal inscriptions from around 2900 to 2335 BC describe Enki giving Getu to Sumerian rulers. The word is difficult to translate precisely. Understanding, wisdom, intelligence, the capacity to perceive how things fit together. Old Akkadian texts from 2334 to 2147 BC associate Enki with the construction of irrigation canals, with the provision of fresh water, with the mental capacity required to plan and build complex projects. Texts from the second dynasty of Lagash portray him as the god who gives advice on temple construction, how to orient a building, how to select materials, how to align a structure with cosmic principles. This is not abstract philosophy, it is applied knowledge, practical instruction that produces functional results. The pattern is consistent. Where other gods demand service, Enki provides tools. Where other gods punish transgression, Enki teaches avoidance. Where other gods guard their secrets, Enki reveals enough for humanity to function, not everything. The texts make clear that some knowledge remains restricted, some secrets too dangerous for mortal minds, but enough to build, enough to heal, enough to measure, enough to record, enough to predict, enough to survive. And according to the texts, he did not do this alone. He did not descend himself to the realm of humans. He sent proxies, 7 sages, the Apkallu, beings born in water, shaped for the boundary between divine and human realms, teachers who carried the knowledge of Enki from the Abzu to the cities of earth. The texts present this as deliberate, organised, intentional, not spontaneous cultural development, but systematic instruction, civilization as curriculum, knowledge as inheritance rather than invention. Whether this represents actual history, cultural memory, or theological explanation remains the question. But the texts do not present it as metaphor, they present it as sequence. Enki saw humanity struggling. Enki sent teachers. The teachers established order, and then the flood came. What survived afterward was not innocence, but memory, not discovery, but restoration. The Sumerians understood themselves as rebuilding something that had been lost, recovering something that had been given, remembering something that had nearly been forgotten. And at the centre of that memory stood 7 names, 7 beings, 7 sages sent by the god who refused to let everything drown. Oannes, who came from water. The first name on the BTM Siri list is Oannes. The text describes him as the one who completed the plans of heaven and earth, not initiated, not began, completed, as if the plans existed prior, and Oannes' role was to bring them to fulfillment in the human realm. Oannes is identified across multiple sources as the same figure known in Akkadian texts as Adapa. The Akkadian myth, Adapa, and the south wind, preserved in fragments from Tel Hadad and Amarna, provides the most detailed account of this figure. The oldest fragments date to the Old Babylonian period, between 1900 and 1600 BC, but the myth itself may be significantly older. Its setting in Eridu, a city that reached its peak importance early in Mesopotamian history, suggests the story preserves very ancient tradition. The Tel Hadad tablets were written in Sumerian. The Amarna fragments found in Egypt were written in Akkadian, both languages, both locations, both preserving versions of the same narrative. The Amarna tablet, dated to the 14th century BC, is the largest and most complete fragment. It begins with a description of Adapa's nature and status. Created him as a protecting spirit among mankind, a sage whose command, like Ea's command, cannot be overturned. He perfected him with great intelligence. He disclosed to him the designs of the land. To him he gave wisdom. Eternal life he did not give him. Several things are established immediately. Adapa is not human in the ordinary sense. He is described as a protecting spirit, though later passages make clear he operates in human form, that he interacts with human society, that he serves as an intermediary between divine and mortal realms. Another name for Enki, creates him specifically to function among humanity. His purpose is explicitly stated in the verb, disclosed, revealed, made known. Adapa is a disclosure mechanism. The designs of the land, the patterns of cosmic order, the structures by which civilization functions, these are revealed through him. The myth describes Adapa serving as a priest in Eridu. Every day he provides offerings for the temple. He bakes bread. He prepares water. He performs the rituals that maintain the relationship between Eridu and its gods. One day, Adapa goes out on a fishing boat into the Persian Gulf. He is sailing when suddenly the south wind rises. The wind is violent. It capsizes the boat. Adapa is thrown into the water. In his anger, Adapa speaks. He curses the south wind. The text gives the specific words. South wind, I shall break your wing. And immediately the wing of the south wind is broken. For 7 days the wind does not blow. The absence is noticed. Anu, the sky god, the supreme deity of the pantheon, calls his vizier and asks why the south wind has ceased. The vizier investigates and reports. Adapa, son of Ea, has broken the wind's wing. Anu summons Adapa to heaven to answer for this act. Here the text becomes complex. E warns Adapa before he ascends. You will be offered food and water. Do not eat or drink. They will be food and water of death. But if you are offered garment and oil, accept them. Adapa obeys. He ascends to the gate of heaven. At the gate, Adapa encounters two gods, Dumuzi and Gezida. He placates them with praise. They speak favourably on his behalf when he is brought before Anu. Anu questions him. Why did you break the wing of the south wind? Adapa explains. The wind overturned his boat while he was fishing for the temple of Ea. It was not malice, but reaction to the disruption of his sacred duty. Anu is troubled, not by the action itself, but by what it reveals. Adapa possessed the power to paralyze a cosmic force simply through speech. This indicates he has been given profound knowledge by Ea, knowledge that should belong only to the gods. Anu speaks to the assembled deities. Why did Ea disclose to an imperfect human the plan of heaven and earth? What should be done with him? But then something unexpected happens. Instead of punishment, Anu offers Adapa food and water, not of death, of life. The text is explicit. These are the bread and water of immortality. If Adapa eats and drinks, he will become immortal. He will join the company of the gods permanently. But Adapa, following Ea's instruction, refuses. He declines the food. He declines the water. Anu is astonished. Why did you not eat? Why did you not drink? Now you shall not have eternal life. Adapa responds that Ea instructed him to refuse, and he obeyed his lord. Anu realizes what has occurred. Ea has deliberately prevented Adapa from becoming immortal. Anu offers garment and oil instead, which Adapa accepts as instructed. Then Anu sends Adapa back to earth, back to his role among humanity. The myth ends with this return, but the implications unfold across the remainder of the text tradition. Why did Ea deceive his own servant? Why provide wisdom but withhold immortality? The text offers explanation through structure rather than statement. Adapa is described in Fragment D as a seed of humankind. He is a prototype, a model. If Adapa had become immortal and remained in heaven, humanity would have lost its teacher. E would have lost his agent in the human realm. The revelation of knowledge would have stopped. Adapa's mortality is necessary for his function. He must live among humans. He must operate within the human lifespan. He must experience the same limitations as those he is teaching. Only then can the knowledge be transmitted in a form humanity can actually use. But Adapa has been given something else. Power through language. The myth makes this explicit. When Adapa curses the south wind, the wind breaks. Not through physical force, through speech. The word has power. This is not metaphor in the Mesopotamian context. It is technical description. Adapa has been taught the words of power, the formulas by which the patterns of reality can be manipulated. The Mesopotamians called this magic, though the term carries different weight than its modern usage. Magic in this context means applied knowledge of cosmic principles, language used with precision to produce specific effects. Scholar Piotr Michalowski has argued that what Adapa demonstrates is esoteric knowledge, the art of incantation, the discipline of ritual speech. Adapa does not shout randomly at the wind. He speaks specific words in a specific way that engages the deep structure of reality. He knows the wind's true name. He knows the formula by which natural forces can be addressed and bound. This knowledge is precisely what Anu finds disturbing. Adapa possesses wisdom that should belong only to the Anunnaki, the great gods. He has access to secrets, and secrets in the Mesopotamian understanding are dangerous. They can be used properly or improperly. They can build or they can destroy. Giving such knowledge to humanity is a risk, but Ea took that risk. According to the catalogue of texts and authors, a text from the Neo-Assyrian library at Nineveh, dated around 700 BC, Adapa is credited with writing down Ea's teaching. The catalogue lists major categories of Mesopotamian scholarship: exorcism, liturgy, celestial omens, physiognomic omens, birth omens, medical diagnosis, dream interpretation, mythological narratives. At the end of each category, the catalogue states, "From the mouth of Ea." And then, Adapa wrote them down. This is significant. Adapa is not merely a mythological figure. He is presented as the first scholar, the original scribe, the one who translated divine knowledge into written form that could be preserved and transmitted across generations. When the flood came, the knowledge survived because it had been recorded. When humanity rebuilt, they did not have to start from nothing. They had texts, they had lists, they had formulas, they had the writings Adapa had compiled under Ea's dictation. Whether this represents literal history is one question. Whether the Mesopotamian scholarly class believed it represents literal history is a different question, and the evidence suggests they did believe. Throughout the first millennium BC, Assyrian and Babylonian scholars invoked Adapa when they copied texts. They referred to their own work as preserving the revelation given in primeval time. They understood themselves as links in a chain of transmission that reached back before the flood to the first sage, who received directly from the god of wisdom himself. The Greek writer Berossus, writing around 291 BC, provides another version of this same figure. Berossus was a Babylonian priest who composed a history of Babylon in Greek, the Babyloniaca, dedicated to the Seleucid king Antiochus I. The original work is lost, but fragments were preserved by later writers, including Eusebius and Josephus. In the first book, Berossus describes a creature called Oannes, who emerged from the Persian Gulf in the region near Babylon. In the first year appeared a beast named Oannes, who came from the Erythraean Sea in the area adjacent to Babylonia. Its entire body was that of a fish, but under the fish's head there was another, human head and human feet, attached to the fish's tail. Its voice and speech were human and articulate. Oannes, Berossus explains, spent his days teaching the people. He gave them letters and sciences and crafts of all types. He taught the founding of cities, the establishment of temples, the introduction of laws, land measurement, seed planting, and fruit gathering. In general, it taught them everything that is connected with civilized life. From that time, nothing further has been discovered. That final sentence carries weight. From that time, nothing further has been discovered. All subsequent development, in Berossus's account, was elaboration and combination of what Oannes originally taught. Humanity did not invent civilization. It received civilization. It has been maintaining and transmitting what was given at the beginning. Oannes is almost certainly the Greek rendering of Ioanna. The connection is widely accepted among scholars. Same figure, same function, same location, same teachings. The fish form in Berossus's account aligns with the later artistic representations of the Apkallu as fishman hybrids. The emphasis on writing and systematic knowledge aligns with the catalogue's attribution of texts to Adapa. 3 names, 3 traditions, 3 languages, Oannes in Sumerian, Adapa in Akkadian, Oannes in Greek, all describing the same primordial sage. The first teacher, the one who came from water at Eridu and established the patterns of civilized existence. The texts do not present this as gradual cultural evolution. They present it as sudden instruction, a specific individual bringing specific knowledge at a specific time in a specific place. And they present this knowledge as originating not from human discovery, but from divine disclosure. E spoke, Adapa wrote, humanity learned. What remains in question is not whether the Mesopotamians believed this. They clearly did. What remains in question is what they were preserving. A memory of an actual teacher, a personification of the moment writing was invented, a theological explanation for the origins of complex society, or something else entirely, something that lies in the space between history and symbol, between event and interpretation. The texts provide no resolution. They simply repeat, across centuries and languages, the same essential claim. Before the flood, a sage came from water. He bore the knowledge of Enki. He taught the foundations of civilization. And his name was Ioanna, the catalogue of impossible knowledge. What exactly did the Apkallu teach? The texts are specific. This is not vague wisdom or general enlightenment. The Mesopotamian sources list domains of knowledge with the same precision they list kings and cities and building projects. The catalogue of texts and authors, compiled in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh around 700 BC, provides the most systematic account. The catalogue begins with exorcistic practices, the series of texts called incantations and prayers. These are not simple appeals to gods, they are technical formulas, precise linguistic constructions designed to compel specific entities, to bind harmful forces, to purify contaminated spaces. The texts include the proper materials to use, the proper times to perform the rituals, the proper words to speak. Each incantation has structure, opening invocation, statement of problem, command to the entity causing the problem, closing affirmation. Miss any element and the ritual fails. The catalogue attributes these texts to Ea. The exorcist speaks with the authority of the god of wisdom. He uses formulas Ea himself designed. The knowledge is not human invention, but divine revelation transmitted through the Apkallu and preserved in written form. Next, liturgical texts. The proper prayers for temple service. Which prayers for which gods, at which times of day, and which seasons of the year. The relationship between gods and humans in Mesopotamian understanding operates through regular ritual maintenance. The gods must be fed, clothed, honoured, addressed with correct titles, given appropriate offerings. Fail to maintain the ritual, and the relationship breaks down. The god withdraws favour, the city suffers. The liturgy is infrastructure, it holds cosmic order in place. The texts teach how to maintain that infrastructure. Then celestial omens, the series called Enuma Anu Enlil, when the gods, Anu and Enlil, 70 tablets, 7,000 omens, observations of lunar eclipses, solar eclipses, planetary positions, weather phenomena, earthquakes. Each observation is paired with an interpretation. If the moon is eclipsed and appears red on the 15th day, the king will die. If Venus appears in the east during Adaru month, there will be rain. If Mars approaches the Pleiades, there will be plague. This is not superstition. This is systematic observation paired with correlation. The Mesopotamian scholars spent centuries recording celestial events and noting what followed. The patterns they detected formed the basis for prediction, not perfect prediction, but probability based on accumulated data. Modern scholars acknowledge that Mesopotamian astronomy was the most advanced in the ancient world precisely because they kept such meticulous records over such long periods. And according to their own accounts, the foundation for this work was laid by the Apkallu, who taught the first humans to watch the sky and understand its language. Physiognomic omens come next. The reading of bodies. The catalogue lists texts that teach how to interpret physical features, the shape of a skull, the formation of ears, the pattern of lines on a palm, the distribution of moles. Each feature corresponds to a destiny, a character, a potential future. This might seem arbitrary to modern understanding, but consider the underlying principle. The body is a text. It can be read by those who know the system. Mesopotamian physicians used physiognomy alongside symptom observation to diagnose illness and predict recovery. It was part of a larger diagnostic framework. Birth omens. The interpretation of abnormal births, both human and animal. If a woman gives birth to twins with certain features, if a ewe delivers a lamb with a particular deformity, each anomaly is recorded and paired with an outcome. These omens were taken seriously in royal courts. The birth of an unusual animal in the royal flock could prompt diplomatic caution or military preparation, depending on the specific details of the anomaly and the historical pattern associated with it. Medical diagnosis. The most extensive category, 40 tablets of recorded symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments. These texts describe how to recognize illnesses based on physical signs, fever patterns, skin conditions, respiratory symptoms, digestive complaints, behavioral changes. For many conditions, the texts provide treatments, herbal remedies, poultices, dietary restrictions. Some treatments were effective by modern standards. Mesopotamian medicine understood infection control, wound care, pain management, some surgical procedures, not through modern germ theory, but through observation of what worked. The catalogue states these medical texts came from the mouth of Ea and were written down by a dapper. The implication is clear. Medicine, like other knowledge domains, was revealed rather than discovered. The Apkallu taught humans which plants heal which ailments, which combinations produce which effects, how to identify symptoms, how to distinguish between similar conditions, how to predict whether a patient will survive. Dream interpretation follows, the reading of visions experienced during sleep. The Mesopotamians believed dreams provided messages from gods, warnings from spirits, glimpses of possible futures. But not every dream meant something. The texts taught which dreams mattered and which were merely random mental activity. They taught symbol recognition. They taught how to distinguish divine communication from ordinary fear or wish. Mathematical texts, geometry for land measurement, arithmetic for accounting, algebraic methods for solving specific practical problems. The Mesopotamians used a base 60 number system, which is why we still divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. Their mathematical tablets show sophisticated problem-solving methods. They could calculate areas of irregular fields. They could determine how many bricks were needed for a wall of specific dimensions. They could figure compound interest on loans. This mathematics was not abstract theory, it was applied technology, and according to tradition, it was taught by the Apkallu. Berossus, writing 600 years after the catalogue was compiled, provides a similar inventory. Oannes taught letters, sciences and crafts. He taught city founding, temple establishment, law promulgation and land measurement. He taught agriculture, seed selection and harvest timing. He taught construction techniques, irrigation methods and trade principles. And Berossus concludes with that striking statement, "From that time, nothing further has been discovered." This is not merely a theological claim. It reflects a specific understanding of history. The Mesopotamians did not believe in progress as a linear process of continuous discovery. They believed in restoration. The flood destroyed or damaged much of what had been established. What came afterward was recovery of what had been lost. New texts were not new knowledge. They were commentaries on old knowledge, elaborations of original revelation, applications of principles taught by the Apkallu. The scholar's task in this understanding was not to invent, but to preserve and transmit. The Ummanu, the human scholars who succeeded the Apkallu, saw themselves as guardians of inherited wisdom. They copied tablets meticulously. They trained students in the old formulas. They maintained the tradition. Innovation was not celebrated. Fidelity was celebrated. The closer a text stayed to the original revelation, the more authority it carried. This has profound implications for how we interpret Mesopotamian knowledge systems. Modern scholarship tends to explain complex ideas as gradual development. Writing evolved from simple pictograms to sophisticated cuneiform. Mathematics developed from basic counting to advanced calculation. Medicine progressed from superstition to empirical observation. But the Mesopotamians themselves did not tell that story. They told a different story. Knowledge came first. It came complete. It came from outside human society. The Apkallu brought it from Ea. They taught specific domains in systematic fashion. What humans did afterward was learn, practice, refine, and transmit what they had been given. Which story is true? Did knowledge emerge gradually through human experimentation, or was it transmitted in organised fashion from an external source? The archaeological record shows continuity of development, but the textual record insists on revelation. These are not necessarily contradictory. It is possible for knowledge to be transmitted and then developed. It is possible for initial instruction to be followed by generations of elaboration. The question is not whether Mesopotamians innovated. They clearly did. The question is whether they innovated from zero or whether they innovated from a foundation someone else established. The texts say the foundation came from the Apkallu. They list what the Apkallu taught: exorcism, liturgy, astronomy, physiognomy, medicine, dream interpretation, mathematics, agriculture, architecture, law, the tools of civilization, the frameworks by which complex society organizes itself and maintains order. And the texts say this knowledge came before the flood, not after, not during the slow rebuilding, before, in the time when sages walked among humans and spoke with divine authority and wrote down what Ea dictated to them. The tablets are real, the knowledge systems are documented, the attributions are consistent across centuries. What remains unclear is not what the Mesopotamians believe, but whether what they believed reflects something that actually happened, or whether it reflects a necessary myth to explain the existence of knowledge they could not otherwise account for. Either way, the catalogue exists. 7,000 omens, 40 tablets of medical texts, 70 tablets of astronomical observations, mathematical tables, legal codes, agricultural manuals, temple rituals, exorcistic formulas, all attributed directly or indirectly to the teaching of the Apkallu, all preserved because Adapa wrote them down, all maintained because the Umanu understood themselves as guardians of revelation rather than creators of new insight. Impossible knowledge if we assume humans developed everything independently. Systematic knowledge if we allow the possibility that someone taught them. The texts make their claim. The evidence sits in museums. The question remains open. 7 names, 7 cities. The BTM Seri ritual text preserves the complete list. 7 Apkallu, 7 names, each associated with a specific role, a specific location, a specific function in the structure of antediluvian civilization. The ritual itself dates to the early 1st millennium BC, but the tradition it records is older. The list appears with minor variations across multiple sources, but the core sequence remains stable. First, Oannes, who completed the plans of heaven and earth. Associated with Eridu and with the first king, Alulim, Oannes, as already discussed, is identified with Adapa. He is the prototype, the first sage, the one who establishes the pattern all others follow. His title emphasizes completion. The plans existed, but required implementation in the human realm. Oannes brought divine design into material reality. Second, Oannes, who is given broad understanding. The name itself means something like Oannes the Good. The text does not specify which city or which king he served, but the Uruk list of kings and sages, compiled much later around 165-164 BC, provides additional detail. Oannes is associated with the second antediluvian king, Alagar of Bad Tibira. His title, Broad Understanding, suggests comprehensive knowledge, not specialized expertise, but wide-ranging competence across multiple domains. Third, Enmeduga, to whom a good fate is decreed. The name includes the element me, which in Sumerian refers to the divine principles or powers that structure reality. The me are the fundamental patterns by which the cosmos operates. To have a good fate decreed suggests Enmeduga was especially favoured, especially empowered to fulfill his function. The Uruk list associates him with Ameluana, the third antediluvian king, and with the city of Larak. Fourth, Enmegalama, who was born in a house. This phrasing is unusual. The other Apkallu are described as born in water, born in the river, coming from the sea. Enmegalama is born in a house. This might indicate he was born on land rather than emerging from water, or it might indicate he was born in a temple, a house of the gods. The Uruk list links him to the king Amenuna and to the city of Sippar. Fifth, Enmebeluga, who grew up on a river flat. Back to the water association. River flat suggests the marshy borderland between river and dry ground, the liminal space, the place where water and earth meet. This resonates with the broader pattern of the Apkallu as boundary figures, neither fully divine nor fully human, operating in the space between realms. He is associated with King Enmenluana of Sippar. Sixth, Anenlilda, the purification priest from Eridu. This title is more specific than the others. Not just a sage, but a purification priest, the one who performs rituals to remove contamination, to restore purity, to maintain boundary between clean and unclean. And he is specifically from Eridu, the city of Enki, the source point of the entire tradition. He is linked to King Dumuzi the shepherd and to the city of Quara. 7th, Abzu, who ascended to heaven, the only Apkallu explicitly said to have gone up. The others came from water. Abzu went to sky. His name includes Utu, the sun god, Abzu, the freshwater deep, sun and abyss, the full vertical span of the cosmos. He is associated with Ubatutu, the final antediluvian king, and with Shuruppak, the city where Ziusudra received warning of the flood. 7 sages, 7 kings, 7 cities. The structure is deliberate. Each king has a sage. Each city receives instruction. The distribution is not random. Eridu appears twice, reinforcing its status as the source point. Sippur appears twice, suggesting its importance as a centre of learning. Bad Tabira, Larak, Quara, Shuruppak each receive 1 sage, 1 king, 1 period of guidance. The Sumerian king list provides the chronological framework. 8 kings ruled before the flood, their combined reigns totaling 241,200 years. Modern scholars understand these numbers as mythological rather than historical, but the structure matters more than the specific durations. 8 kings, 7 sages. The 8th king, Ziusudra or Utnapishtim, depending on the version, is the flood survivor, the one who preserves knowledge through catastrophe. The 7 Apkallu establish civilization. The 8th king maintains it through disaster and passes it to the post-flood world. After the flood, the BTM Siri text lists 4 more sages, but these are explicitly different. They are described as 2/3 Apkallu, or of human descent. They are post-flood scholars who claim lineage from the original 7, but who do not possess the same nature or authority. The text names them Nungul Pirigoldim, Apkallu of Enmerkar, who brought down Ishtar from heaven into the sanctuary. Enmerkar is a legendary king of Uruk, famous in Sumerian literature. Nungul Pirigoldim serves him, but he does not come from water. He is human, trained in the tradition, maintaining what was established. Pirigol Nungul, born in Kesh, who angered Adud so that no rain fell for 3 years. The detail is significant. Pirigol Nungul made an error. He disrupted cosmic order. The gods punished the land. This would never be said of the original 7. The Antediluvian Apkallu do not make mistakes. The post-flood Umanu do. They are guardians of knowledge, not sources of knowledge. Pirigol Abzu, born in Adab, who angered Ea by hanging his seal on a sacred fish, and was struck by a fuller with his own seal. Again, transgression and punishment. The post-flood sages can err, they can offend gods, they can suffer consequences. Lunana, 2/3 Apkallu, who expelled a dragon from the temple of Ishtar. He performs a heroic act, but the text emphasizes his partial status. 2/3, not fully Apkallu, part human. His power is real, but derivative. The distinction is crucial. Before the flood, 7 pure Apkallu born of water sent by Enki establishing civilization. After the flood, human scholars, trained in the tradition, maintaining and transmitting, but no longer receiving direct revelation. This transition appears in other texts as well. The Era epic, dating to the 9th or 8th century BC, describes the god Marduk lamenting the loss of the Apkallu. I made those Umanu go down to the Abzu, and I said they were not to come back up. Later in the same text, Marduk asks, where are the 7 Apkallu of the Abzu, the holy carp, who are perfect in lofty wisdom like Ea their lord, who can make my body holy? They are gone. They descended back to the realm of Enki. They are no longer available. The transition has been made. The original teachers have withdrawn. What remains are their students, their texts, their legacy. The knowledge persists, but the direct link to the divine source has been severed. This theological structure explains something important about how Mesopotamian scholars understood their work. They were not inventing, they were preserving. They were not discovering, they were remembering. The original revelation came through the 7 Apkallu. Everything afterward was commentary, elaboration, application. The scribes who copied tablets in Ashurbanipal's library understood themselves as links in a chain reaching back to Oannes. They were the Umanu, the guardians, not the sources. The 7 names are not arbitrary, they are foundation. They represent the complete transmission of knowledge from divine to human realms. 7 domains, perhaps, 7 aspects of wisdom, 7 categories of cosmic order made accessible to mortal minds. The texts do not specify exactly how the correspondences work, but the structure itself carries meaning, completeness, wholeness, the full necessary instruction given before the catastrophe that would require humanity to rebuild without the teachers present. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Quara, Shuruppak. These cities existed. Archaeological work has located most of them. They were real places occupied by real people. The Sumerian king list gives them antediluvian status, meaning they existed before whatever historical event the Mesopotamians remembered as the flood. Whether that event was the end of the Ubaid period, or a major inundation around 2900 BC, or a cultural memory of more ancient sea level changes, the structure remains. These cities were old. They predated the later dynasties, and tradition associated them with the first teachers, the Apkallu, who came from water when Enki sent them to instruct the children of clay. 7 names, 7 cities, 7 ages of instruction before the waters rose and civilization had to be restored from memory and preserved text. The list is not myth in the sense of fiction. It is myth in the sense of foundational narrative. The story a culture tells itself about where it came from and what it must preserve. Whether the 7 Apkallu were historical individuals, or personifications of knowledge transmission, or symbolic representations of the founding of specific disciplines, or something else entirely, they functioned as origin point for the Mesopotamian intellectual tradition. And that tradition took them seriously, named them, listed them, associated them with kings and cities, carved their images on palace walls, buried their figures beneath houses, invoked them in rituals. For more than 2,000 years, from the earliest Sumerian texts through the final Babylonian tablets, the 7 Apkallu remained present as the ones who taught humanity how to be civilized. From water they came, in cities they taught, to water they returned, and what they established became the foundation everything else was built upon, guardians carved in stone. In the mid-19th century, British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard excavated the ancient Assyrian city of Apkallu, modern Nimrud, in northern Iraq. The site had been the capital of the Assyrian Empire under King Ashurnasirpal II, who reigned from 883 to 859 BC. What Layard's team discovered beneath the Iraqi soil astonished the archaeological world. A vast palace complex, massive stone reliefs, winged figures flanking doorways, protective spirits standing guard over thresholds. These were not abstract symbols, they were specific beings, rendered in meticulous detail. Some had human bodies with wings and the heads of eagles. Some had fully human features, with wings extending from their shoulders. Some wore robes that appeared to be fish skins, scaled and draped, with the fish head forming a hood over the human head beneath. They all held similar objects, a bucket in one hand, a pine cone or similar implement in the other, and many of them stood beside representations of the king, as if attending him, guiding him, protecting him. Across the reliefs ran the standard inscription of Ashurnasirpal II, carved in cuneiform, proclaiming his victories, his building projects, his divine mandate. But the protective figures bore no inscriptions of their own. Their identity was apparently self-evident to those who saw them. Modern scholars, examining the iconography and comparing it to textual sources, have identified these figures as Apkallu. The British Museum holds several of these reliefs. Catalogue number 14561 shows a human-headed winged figure dressed in what appears to be a long fringed robe. Museum number 98064 depicts an eagle-headed winged figure in similar posture, facing right, holding bucket and cone. Catalogue 124573 shows a figure clearly wearing a fish skin, the scaled texture carved in detail, the fish head visible over the human head, wings extending from the shoulders. These were not decorative choices. In Mesopotamian understanding, images were not merely representative, they were operative. An image of a god or protective spirit did not symbolize that being. It provided a dwelling place for that being. The carved relief was a door. The spirit could enter through it. The spirit could function through it. Placing Apkallu reliefs at thresholds and doorways was not artistic flourish. It was architectural magic. It installed guardians. The same practice appears in foundation deposits. During excavations at the ancient city of Assur in northern Iraq, archaeologists uncovered 117 clay figurines buried beneath the floors of a priest's house. The figurines were small, carefully moulded, and diverse in form. Some depicted dogs, some depicted human-like figures, some depicted fishman hybrids. Many matched the descriptions from ritual texts like BTM Siri. These were apotropaic deposits, protective installations. The figurines were not buried as trash or as offerings to the dead. They were buried as guardians, stationed at strategic points to prevent evil from entering. The BTM Seri ritual provides specific instructions. When a house requires protection, certain figurines must be made and positioned. Fish Apkallu at specific points, bird Apkallu at others, human form Apkallu at still others. Each type has a function, each position has a purpose. The ritual is technical, precise. It requires knowledge of which guardian repels which threat. Some figurines were to be made of tamarisk wood, which had purifying properties. Others were to be made of clay from particular locations. The materials mattered. The wood or clay was not merely the substance from which the figure was crafted. It was part of the magical technology. Tamarisk purifies. Clay from the riverbank connects to the Abzu, the realm of Enki. The figurine becomes a channel through which the protective power of the Apkallu can operate. The ritual text specifies that these figures are creatures of the Abzu. They belong to the realm of Enki. They draw their power from that source. When properly installed with proper ritual, they function as extensions of the original Apkallu, maintaining the boundary between order and chaos, between the protected space and the threatening outside. This practice continued for centuries. Long after the original 7 Apkallu had descended back to the Abzu, the Mesopotamians continued to invoke them, to represent them, to install their images as guardians. The tradition was not merely remembered, it was operationalized. The Apkallu were not historical figures whose time had passed. They were active forces whose presence could still be accessed through proper procedure. But why 3 forms? Fish, bird, human? The texts provide hints, but not explicit explanation. The fish form connects most clearly to the Abzu, to water, to Enki's realm. Berossus describes Oannes as fish-bodied. The earliest iconographic type, according to scholar F.A.M. Vigerman, dates to the Kassite period in the mid-2nd millennium BC, though the tradition it represents is older. Fish Apkallu are associated particularly with the southern cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, the cities where the tradition began. The bird form, specifically the eagle-headed Apkallu, appears to be a later development. Wigerman suggests this iconographic type was adopted from foreign sources and secondarily identified with the Apkallu tradition. The bird connects to sky, to flight, to the realm of Anu and the higher gods. The eagle specifically was associated with kingship and divine authority. An eagle-headed Apkallu combines the wisdom of the sages with the power of heaven. The fully human form emphasizes the accessibility of the Apkallu. They could walk among humans. They could speak. They could teach. They operated in human cities under human kings. Their wisdom was not abstract or distant. It was practical and present. All 3 forms appear together in ritual contexts. All 3 perform purifying and exercising functions. All 3 guard thresholds. The variation might represent different aspects of the same beings, or different ranks within the category of Apkallu, or different specializations. The texts do not provide a systematic taxonomy. They simply acknowledge that protective spirits come in different forms, all called Apkallu, all connected to Enki, all functioning as guardians. The objects they hold also carry meaning. The bucket is often interpreted as containing water from the Abzu, purifying water, life-giving water, the liquid that maintains cosmic order. The cone or similar implement is thought to be a sprinkler or brush used to sprinkle the purifying water. The Apkallu blesses, it cleanses, it marks the boundary. In some reliefs, the Apkallu stands beside the sacred tree, a stylized plant that appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian art. The tree represents life, fertility, the axis connecting underworld, earth and heaven. The Apkallu tends the tree, maintains it, ensures its vitality. This is consistent with the broader function of the sages. They maintain order. They preserve the patterns established at creation. They prevent entropy and chaos from overwhelming structure. The Neo-Assyrian kings clearly valued these representations. Ashur-Nisirpal II covered the walls of his palace with them. Sargon II, who ruled from 722 to 705 BC, included similar figures in his palace at Dur-Sharrukin. Sennacherib at Nineveh, Esarhaddon, Ashurbanipal, generation after generation of Assyrian rulers surrounded themselves with images of the Apkallu, not as decoration, but as defence, not as art, but as technology. And this was not mere superstition, at least not by their understanding. The Mesopotamian worldview did not distinguish sharply between physical and spiritual causation. A disease could be caused by bacteria or by demons, and both required treatment. A building could fall because of poor engineering or because of malevolent spirits, and both required prevention. Installing Apkallu guardians was part of comprehensive protective strategy. Address the physical vulnerabilities with good architecture. Address the spiritual vulnerabilities with proper ritual and imagery. The carved reliefs from Nimrud now stand in museums in London, New York, Baghdad. They are catalogued as ancient art. They are studied for their craftsmanship, their historical context, their political messaging. But to the people who made them and the people who lived with them, they were not art. They were active presences. The Apkallu were there, in the stone, guarding the threshold, maintaining the boundary, preserving order. Whether the Apkallu were ever physical beings is one question. Whether the Mesopotamians believed they could still access the power of those beings through imagery and ritual is a different question. And the evidence for the second is unambiguous. They believed. They installed the guardians. They maintained the tradition. For over 1,000 years, from the Kassite period through the fall of the Assyrian Empire, the Apkallu remained present in stone and clay, watching doorways, protecting houses, standing beside kings. Not symbols, guardians, not myths, presences. The 7 sages who taught humanity civilization did not fade into legend. They were carved into walls and buried beneath floors and invoked in rituals, because the knowledge they brought was understood as still active, still accessible, still protective. The stone figures are silent now, the rituals are no longer performed, the houses they protected have crumbled, but the images remain. Fishmen, birdmen, winged humans, holding buckets and cones, standing watch, still guarding, though the civilization that needed their protection is dust, and still attesting, for anyone who looks carefully, that the people who made them understood the Apkallu as more than stories. They understood them as forces that could be invoked, represented and installed, as teachers whose knowledge survived the flood, as guardians whose presence could still be accessed. The carvings make that claim in stone, the ritual of protection. The BT Msiri text is not narrative, it is procedural, not a story about the Apkallu, but instructions for using their power. The text title means House of Confinement or Protected House. It belongs to a category of Mesopotamian literature concerned with apotropaic magic, the ritual prevention of harm. The ritual was performed when a house or its inhabitants required protection from demons, disease, or other threatening forces. The text survives in multiple copies from the 1st millennium BC, but the ritual it describes is older. The procedure is complex, requiring specific materials, specific figurines, specific placements, specific incantations. This is not folk practice. This is technical knowledge, preserved and transmitted within scribal circles, performed by specialists trained in the tradition. The ritual begins with the crafting of figurines. The text specifies which materials to use for which type of figure. Some must be moulded from clay, some carved from tamarisk wood. The choice of material is not arbitrary. Clay connects to creation, to the substance from which humanity itself was fashioned. Clay also comes from the riverbank, from the boundary between water and land, from the realm associated with Enki. A clay figure of an Apkallu, made from river clay, creates a material link to the Abzu, allowing the protective spirit to manifest through the object. Tamarisk wood has purifying properties in Mesopotamian magical practice. It drives away evil. Figurines carved from tamarisk perform especially purifying functions. The text indicates that all beings made of tamarisk are creatures of the Abzu, just as the Apkallu themselves are creatures of the Abzu. The material creates connection. Once the figurines are crafted, they must be positioned. The text provides specific instructions. Some go beneath the threshold, some at the four corners of the house, some near the bed of the sick person if illness prompted the ritual. Each position has strategic importance. Thresholds are vulnerable points, boundaries between inside and outside. Demons enter through doorways. Corners are places where shadows gather, where protection weakens. The bed of a sick person is the site of the demon's attack. The figurines must be placed where they can intercept threats. The ritual also requires paintings or reliefs on the walls. Images of the Apkallu in their various forms. Fish Apkallu, bird Apkallu, human Apkallu. These are not mere decorations accompanying the buried figurines. They are part of the protective system. The painted or carved image provides another doorway through which the Apkallu can enter and operate. Multiple access points create layered defense. The incantation that accompanies the installation names each Apkallu individually. This is the section quoted earlier, but it is worth returning to because the naming itself is the operative element. To name is to invoke. To invoke is to summon. The ritual speaker recites the 7 names with their titles. Oannes, who completed the plans. Oannes, who received broad understanding. Enmeduga, with good fate. Enmegalama, born in a house. Enmebuluga, who grew up on the river flat. Anenlilda, the purification priest. Abzu, who ascended to heaven. Then the text identifies them collectively, the pure carps, the carps from the sea, the 7 Apkallu, born in the river, who keep in order the plans of heaven and earth. This formula establishes identity and function. They are carps, fish from the sea. They are 7. They were born in the river. Their function is to keep order, to maintain the plans of heaven and earth. The verb keep in order is active, not kept in the past, keep in the present. The Apkallu continue their function. The ritual accesses that ongoing activity. After the Antediluvian 7, the text names the 4 post-flood Umanu, Nungul Pirigoldim, Pirigol Nungul, Pirigalabzu, Lunanna. These are described as of human descent, or 2/3 Apkallu. They are lesser in status, but still connected to the tradition. They still bear authority derived from the original 7. Naming them extends the invocation through the full lineage of transmitted wisdom. Then the ritual concludes with a statement of purpose. These figures, these names, these images are installed that the evil of the human adversary, the evil portent, the evil curse, the evil spell, the evil word, the evil eye, the evil illness, the evil demon, may not enter. The list is comprehensive. All forms of harm, physical, spiritual, social. The Apkallu guard against all of it. What makes this ritual particularly significant is its widespread use. This was not obscure practice limited to a single temple or a single city. Betim Seri texts have been found in multiple locations. The ritual was performed in private homes and in palaces. The excavations at Assur, where 117 protective figurines were found beneath a single priest's house, demonstrate practical application. Someone performed this ritual. Someone crafted those figurines. Someone buried them according to the prescribed pattern. Someone believed it worked. The ritual's longevity also testifies to its perceived effectiveness. From at least the early 2nd millennium BC through the fall of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 7th century BC, the Mesopotamians continued to perform BTM Seri, over 1,000 years of continuous practice. If the ritual consistently failed, if houses protected by Apkallu figurines proved no safer than unprotected houses, the practice would have been abandoned. But it persisted, it was copied, it was transmitted, it was performed. This raises an important question. Did it work? By what mechanism could burying clay figurines and reciting names provide protection? Modern understanding would say it didn't work, that any perceived effectiveness was placebo or coincidence. But that explanation may be insufficient. Consider the ritual's psychological effect. A person who performs BTM Seri believes their house is protected. They sleep better, they feel safer, stress decreases, immune function improves. They recover from illness more quickly. The ritual produces measurable physiological benefit through psychological mechanism. That is not superstition. That is the mind-body connection operating according to principles modern medicine recognizes. Consider also the social function. A house where BTM Seri has been performed is marked as under protection. Neighbours know. Potential troublemakers know. The ritual serves as social signal. This household has resources to hire a priest. This household takes protective measures seriously. This household should not be disturbed. The figurines buried beneath the floor are invisible, but the ritual's performance is not secret. It functions as deterrent. Consider the possibility of forces modern science does not measure. Mesopotamian magic operated on the premise that spoken words, properly formed, could affect reality. That intention, focused and directed through ritual action, could shape outcomes. That images could serve as channels for non-physical entities. Modern skepticism dismisses these premises, but Mesopotamian culture, across thousands of years, insisted they were valid. And modern physics, particularly quantum mechanics, has revealed that observation affects outcome, that consciousness interacts with reality in ways 19th century materialism could not account for. Perhaps the Mesopotamians understood something that got lost when mechanistic worldviews became dominant. Regardless of mechanism, the fact remains. The Mesopotamians believed the Apkallu were real. They believed those beings could be invoked. They believed proper ritual could install their protective presence. They performed those rituals for centuries, and they attributed their knowledge of those rituals to the Apkallu themselves, who taught humanity not only agriculture and mathematics, but also how to maintain connection with the sources of protection and order. The BTM Seri text preserves this knowledge in written form, not myth, but manual, not story, but procedure. The Apkallu are not distant legends. They are active forces that can be accessed through proper technique. The ritual provides that technique. The text transmits it across generations. The continuity of practice testifies to persistent belief that the connection works. Whether that belief reflected objective reality or merely psychological and social mechanisms, it shaped behaviour, it organised space, it structured understanding of how safety is maintained and disorder repelled, and it kept the Apkallu present in Mesopotamian life, not as characters in old stories, but as beings whose names were spoken, whose forms were crafted, whose power was installed in the foundations of houses to guard those who slept above. The ritual remains in the texts. The texts remain in museums. The question remains whether what the texts describe is merely interesting ancient belief, or whether it is record of something that still functions if the procedures are followed and the names are spoken and the figurines are buried according to the ancient pattern. The Mesopotamians would say the latter. Modern scholarship says the former. The stone and clay guardians say nothing. They simply stand where they were placed, performing the function they were given for as long as the substance holds together. Words that broke the wind. When Adapa cursed the south wind and its wing broke, something specific happened. The myth does not present this as metaphor. The wind ceased to blow for 7 days. This was noticed at the highest levels of the divine hierarchy. Anu, the sky god, called his vizier and demanded explanation. Why is the south wind stopped? The vizier investigated. The answer: Adapa spoke words that paralyzed a cosmic force. This is presented as extraordinary, but not supernatural. It is technique. Adapa possessed knowledge of how to speak in ways that affect reality. The Mesopotamians had a term for this knowledge: magic. But the term must be understood in its original context, not through modern associations with stage illusions or fantasy fiction. Mesopotamian magic was systematic. It had categories, subdisciplines, technical requirements. Scholar Daniel Schwemmer has identified 4 major types. Liminal magic transforms the ritual client from one state to another. Defensive magic removes and repels evil that is attached to the client. Aggressive magic gives the client superiority, strength, or attractiveness. Witchcraft is illegal aggressive magic used to harm others. The first 2 categories were considered legitimate, even necessary. The third occupied ambiguous territory. The fourth was criminal. All forms of magic operated on shared principles. Words have power. Images can channel forces. Materials carry properties. Actions performed in ritual context produce effects beyond the physical. The universe is responsive to properly constructed speech and properly executed procedure. Incantations were not prayers. A prayer is a request. An incantation is a command. The exorcist does not ask a demon to leave. He orders it to leave. He binds it by name. He invokes authorities the demon cannot resist. He uses formulas that compel obedience. The demon must comply because the words spoken carry inherent power. But not all words carry power. Only specific formulas, spoken in specific contexts by trained specialists. The formula must be correct. The pronunciation must be exact. The timing must be appropriate. Miss any element and the incantation fails. This is not different in principle from chemistry. Mix the right compounds in the right proportions under the right conditions, and a reaction occurs. Vary any component, and nothing happens, or the wrong reaction occurs. Incantations are formulas. Magic is applied knowledge. Adapa knew those formulas. The myth emphasizes that Ea perfected him with intelligence and wisdom. He disclosed to Adapa the designs of the land. Adapa understood how things work. He knew the names. He knew the words of power. When he spoke against the south wind, he used a formula. South wind, I shall break your wing. Name of the target. Statement of the action. Direct, specific, unambiguous. And because Adapa spoke with knowledge, with authority derived from E, the wind's wing broke. The cosmic force ceased to operate. This terrified Anu, and with good reason. If a mortal possessed words that could paralyze natural forces, what else could he do? Could he stop the rain? Could he still the rivers? Could he disrupt the movements of celestial bodies? The knowledge Ea had given Adapa was dangerous precisely because it was effective. The concept of esoteric law appears throughout Mesopotamian texts. Secrets, mysteries, knowledge that must be guarded, transmitted only within closed circles, protected from casual access. The Akkadian terms Piritu and Nisirtu both mean secret, but they carry connotations of protected knowledge, not mere private information. These are the words of power, the formulas of magic, the techniques by which reality can be manipulated. He himself is called Blipiratim in Old Babylonian texts, Lord of Secret Law. He possesses the hidden knowledge. He understands the deep patterns, and he transmitted that knowledge to the Apkallu, who transmitted it to the earliest humans, who preserved it through the flood, who passed it to the scribal scholars, who became the guardians of tradition. This creates a lineage. E knows. The Apkallu learn from E, Adapa writes down what Ea dictates. The texts survive the flood. The Umanu study the texts. They train students. They maintain the formulas. They guard the secrets. At each stage, the knowledge is contained. It is not broadcast. It is not made public. It is transmitted carefully from master to student within the scribal class. Why guard it? Because knowledge is power, and power can be misused. In the wrong hands, the words of power can harm rather than heal. They can curse rather than bless. They can disrupt order rather than maintain it. The Mesopotamian scholarly class understood themselves as holding dangerous knowledge. Their responsibility was to use it properly and prevent its abuse. Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king, who reigned from 669 to 631 BC, boasted of his education in this secret knowledge. An inscription describes his training. I have learnt the art of the Apkallu, Adapa, so that now I am familiar with the secret storehouse of all scribal learning, including celestial and terrestrial portents. The phrasing is precise. He learnt the art of Adapa, not just literacy, but the specialized knowledge Adapa received from Ea, the secret storehouse, the protected formulas. Ashurbanipal claimed access to knowledge that went back to the first sage. He understood himself as heir to a tradition reaching before the flood. And that tradition was not abstract philosophy. It was practical technique, reading omens, interpreting signs, predicting outcomes, performing rituals that produced effects. The inscription continues, I can debate in an assembly of Umanu and discuss with clever oil diviners the treatise if the liver is a replica of the sky. He could participate in technical discussions with trained specialists. He understood the theoretical foundations of divination. He could read the scholarly texts that explained how to interpret the configurations of animal organs to determine divine will and predict future events. Then I used to figure out complicated divisions and multiplications that have no solutions. Mathematical problems, algebraic puzzles, not merely arithmetic, but complex calculation. This was not recreational. Mathematics in Mesopotamia was applied. It solved real problems. Land measurement, construction planning, astronomical calculation, economic management. Ashurbanipal could perform these calculations because he had been trained in the methods the Apkallu originally taught. Finally, time and again I have read the cleverly written compositions in which the Sumerian is obscure and the Akkadian is difficult to interpret correctly. I have studied inscriptions on stone from before the flood which are sealed, obscure and confused. Inscriptions from before the flood. Ashurbanipal believed such texts existed. He believed he could read them. He believed they contained knowledge that survived catastrophe and was transmitted through the Umanu to his own time. Whether such texts actually dated from before the flood is less important than the fact that the scholarly tradition claimed continuity with pre-flood knowledge. They understood their learning as inherited, not invented, as preserved, not discovered. This understanding shaped how magic functioned in Mesopotamian society. It was not separate from other forms of knowledge, it was integrated. The physician who diagnosed illness used incantations alongside herbal remedies. The astronomer who calculated eclipse timing also interpreted omens. The architect who designed temples also performed foundation rituals. Knowledge was unified. The same principles governed medicine, divination, mathematics, and magic. All were techniques for engaging the patterns of reality. All required training. All derived ultimately from the teaching of the Apkallu. The words of power were not gibberish. They were technical terminology, names of demons, epithets of gods, commands in ritual language, descriptions of effects, each word chosen for its specific function within the formula. Change a word and the incantation fails. This is why oral transmission was so important. A student learned from a master. The master spoke. The student repeated until pronunciation was exact. Then the student could perform the ritual independently. But the chain of transmission had to be maintained. Break the chain, lose the knowledge. Adapa broke the wind's wing because he spoke the right words in the right way. The south wind had a name, it had a structure, it had a vulnerability. Adapa knew all three. He used that knowledge to produce an effect. The myth presents this as remarkable, but not impossible. It was technique applied correctly. And that technique, according to Mesopotamian tradition, was not discovered through experimentation. It was revealed. E taught Adapa, Adapa taught others. The knowledge spread through the antediluvian cities. When the flood came, the texts preserved what had been taught. When civilization rebuilt, the Umanu recovered the texts. They maintained the formulas. They guarded the secrets. They trained new students in the art of the Apkallu. The modern mind struggles with this. Words do not move physical objects. Speech does not alter weather patterns. Incantations do not compel demons, because demons do not exist in material reality. But the Mesopotamian worldview did not separate material and spiritual. Both were real. Both operated according to principles. Those principles could be learned and applied. Magic was technology for engaging non-physical dimensions of reality. Whether that technology actually worked is one question. Whether the Mesopotamians believed it worked is answered by the evidence. They performed magic for 3,000 years. They copied the incantations, they trained specialists, they paid for rituals, they structured their society around the premise that words, properly spoken, have power, and they attributed that knowledge to the Apkallu, to Adapa, who spoke against the wind and broke it, to Oannes, who completed the plans of heaven and earth, to the 7 sages who came from water, bearing the secrets of Ea. The words of power were not human invention. They were divine gift transmitted through beings who understood the deep structures of reality and who taught humans just enough to function, but not enough to overthrow the cosmic order. The formulas remain in the texts. The texts remain in archives. The question remains whether the formulas still work, whether the words still carry power, whether someone properly trained in the tradition could speak against the wind and break its wing. The Mesopotamians would say yes. Modern skepticism says no. Adapa's myth says the knowledge was real enough to terrify the gods. Knowledge before the waters rose. Every source that mentions the Apkallu specifies the same temporal framework. Before the flood, not during, not after, before. The 7 sages taught in the Antediluvian age, when the first cities were founded, when the first kings ruled, when the relationship between gods and humans was closer, when lifespans were measured in cosmic rather than human years. Then the flood came, and the age of direct divine instruction ended. This is not merely poetic chronology. The Mesopotamian sources treat the flood as a historical marker, a boundary in time separating 2 distinct phases of civilization. What came before had qualities that could not be replicated afterward. The flood swept away not just people and buildings, but a mode of existence, the possibility of unmediated divine human interaction, the presence of the Apkallu walking in cities, the direct revelation of knowledge. The Sumerian king list structures its entire framework around this divide. The opening line states, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. 8 kings ruled in 5 cities before the flood. Their reigns lasted for absurd durations. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alagar of Bad Tabira, 36,000 years. These are not historical claims. They are theological statements. Time operated differently in the beginning, or the numbers are symbolic, or they use measurement systems no longer understood. Regardless of explanation, the structure is clear. The antediluvian period was fundamentally different. Then the list states simply, the flood swept over. No detail, no explanation, just the fact. After this statement, the list continues, after the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kesh. The kings who follow have realistic reign lengths, 25 years, 40 years, 15 years, human scale duration, normal time has resumed. But something has been lost. The direct connection has been severed. Kingship must be lowered from heaven again, as if the continuity was broken and had to be re-established. The Uruk list of kings and sages, compiled much later, makes the connection explicit. It pairs the 7 antediluvian Apkallu with specific kings, Oannes with Alulim, Uanaduga with Alagar. Each sage served during the reign of a specific king. Each king received instruction from a specific sage, then the flood, then a gap, then post-flood kings with human advisors, the Umanu, who claim descent from the Apkallu tradition, but who are not Apkallu themselves. The BTM Siri text uses the same framework. The 7 Apkallu are born in the river and keep in order the plans of heaven and earth. Then the text transitions to the 4 post-flood sages who are of human descent and 2/3 Apkallu. The purity of the original 7 is contrasted with the partial status of their successors. Something changed. Some quality was lost or diminished. Berossus structures his Babyloniaca the same way. Book 1 describes Oannes emerging from the sea and teaching civilization. The narrative emphasizes completeness. Oannes taught everything. From that time, nothing further has been discovered. All subsequent development was elaboration of what was given at the beginning. Book 2 describes the antediluvian world, the flood, and the preservation of knowledge. The texts were written down and buried at Sippar. After the flood, they were recovered. What came before was transmitted to what came after, but through the narrow channel of preserved text rather than living instruction. This raises a question. What was the flood? The Mesopotamian plain has flooded repeatedly throughout history. Rivers overflow, levees break, cities are damaged, people drown, recovery occurs. None of these events would require mythological explanation. So why does the Mesopotamian tradition single out one specific flood as the catastrophe that ended the antediluvian age? Several answers have been proposed. 1. Archaeological evidence suggests a major inundation around 2900 BC. Deposits of water-laid clay have been found at multiple Sumerian sites from approximately this period. The flood was real, localized to the Mesopotamian plain, but devastating to the population that experienced it. It wiped out cities, it killed most of the population. The survivors had to rebuild from almost nothing. Cultural memory preserved this as the flood. 2. The flood is cultural memory of sea level rise at the end of the last ice age. Between approximately 12,000 and 6,000 BC, ocean levels rose dramatically as glaciers melted. Coastlines moved, river valleys flooded. The Persian Gulf, which had been much smaller, expanded to roughly its current configuration. Communities along the ancient coastline were displaced. This massive environmental change over thousands of years condensed in cultural memory into a single catastrophic event. 3. The flood is metaphor for social collapse. Civilizations rise and fall. The Ubaid period gave way to the Uruk period. Old systems broke down, new systems emerged, the transition was traumatic, political structures collapsed, trade networks dissolved, knowledge was lost. The flood is the chaos of civilization disrupting and having to reconstitute itself. 4. Some combination of the above. A real local flood became the framework for organizing memory of a longer period of change and loss. Multiple disasters over centuries were mythologically compressed into a single event. The theological significance of the flood as boundary, as divine judgment, as test of human endurance, made it the organizing principle for how the past was understood. Regardless of what historical event or events underlie the flood traditions, the texts agree on its function in Mesopotamian understanding. It marked an ending. The Antediluvian age, when divine instruction was direct and sages walked among humans, gave way to the post-flood age, when humans must rely on preserved texts and transmitted tradition. The difference is not simply temporal, it is ontological. Something about the nature of reality changed. The era epic presents this change from a divine perspective. Marduk, speaking to the other gods, describes how he removed the Umanu, the craftsmen and sages, responsible for maintaining his cult statue. I made those Umanu go down to the Abzu, and I said they were not to come back up. He sent them away. They descended to Enki's realm, the subterranean ocean, and did not return. Later, Marduk laments their absence. Where are the 7 Apkallu of the Abzu, the holy carp, who are perfect in lofty wisdom like Ea their lord, who can make my body holy? They are gone. Marduk himself removed them. Now he suffers the consequences. His cult cannot be properly maintained because the ones who possessed the necessary knowledge are no longer available. This is presented as irreversible. The Apkallu will not return. Their time has passed. What remains are their human students, the Umanu, who carry on the tradition but without the full authority and capability of the original sages. This withdrawal of the Apkallu functions as explanation for why post-flood civilization, despite its achievements, never quite matched what came before. The texts were preserved, the knowledge was transmitted, but something was missing: the living presence of the sages, the direct instruction, the immediate access to divine wisdom. Humanity was left with manuals and formulas, but without the masters who created them. The Mesopotamian scholarly class understood themselves as operating in this diminished condition. They were guardians of inherited wisdom, not originators. They copied tablets carefully because the tablets contained what the Apkallu had written down. They performed rituals precisely because the rituals encoded knowledge from the Antediluvian age. Innovation was not celebrated, fidelity was celebrated. Staying close to the original revelation was the measure of scholarly success. This has profound implications for how we interpret Mesopotamian civilization. Modern scholarship tends to frame ancient societies as working their way up from simplicity to complexity. Writing develops gradually. Mathematics becomes more sophisticated over time. Medicine advances through accumulated observation. This is the standard narrative of progress. But the Mesopotamians told a different story. Complexity came first. It was taught by the Apkallu. The flood damaged but did not destroy the transmitted knowledge. What followed was recovery and elaboration, not invention. Post-flood civilization was restoration, not genesis. Which narrative is correct? The archaeological record shows continuity of development. Pottery styles evolve, architecture becomes more sophisticated, writing systems become more efficient. This looks like progress, but it could also be recovery. A society rebuilding from catastrophe would show the same pattern. Gradual improvement as lost knowledge is recovered and applied. The textual record insists on revelation. The knowledge came from outside. The Apkallu taught it. Humans preserved it. The flood nearly destroyed it. The Umanu restored it. This is not progress narrative, it is preservation narrative. And preservation narratives arise when a culture believes it possesses something fragile and valuable that must be maintained against the constant threat of loss. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps Mesopotamian civilization developed through normal processes of human innovation and problem solving. And perhaps the Mesopotamians understood this development through a theological framework that attributed innovation to divine gift rather than human cleverness. The framework shaped how they transmitted knowledge, how they organized their scribal schools, how they valued their texts. Or perhaps the Mesopotamians were reporting what they genuinely remembered, that before the flood, teachers came, that they established systematic knowledge, that the flood disrupted transmission, that recovery required enormous effort and was never quite complete, that the post-flood world operated at a lower level than the antediluvian world, not because humans were less capable, but because the sages were no longer present. The texts make their claim. Knowledge before the waters rose, teaching in the first cities, the Apkallu walking among the early kings, then the catastrophe, then the long aftermath of remembering and rebuilding. The question is not whether the Mesopotamians believed this. The question is whether their belief reflects actual history or merely provides theological explanation for the existence of complex knowledge in ancient society. The flood remains the pivot point. Before it, the age of direct instruction. After it, the age of preserved text. Every source maintains this structure. Every tradition places the Apkallu in the time before, and every tradition describes the post-flood world as working from inheritance rather than discovering from nothing. Whether the inheritance was knowledge or merely the story of knowledge, it shaped 3,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization. It kept the names of 7 sages alive across centuries. It maintained the belief that wisdom comes from outside, not from within. It established the scribes as guardians rather than creators. It made preservation the highest scholarly virtue, and it kept alive the claim that once, before the waters rose, someone taught humanity how to be civilized. The claim remains in the tablets. The tablets remain in museums. The question remains open. When the sages descended, the era epic, composed in the 8th or 9th century BC, describes a crisis in the divine realm. Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonian pantheon, requires his cult statue to be refurbished. The statue is not merely symbolic. In Mesopotamian theology, the statue is the god's body in the human realm. It must be properly maintained. But refurbishment requires specialists, craftsmen and sages with knowledge of proper materials, proper techniques, proper rituals. Marduk laments that he cannot find these specialists. The ones who originally possessed the necessary knowledge are no longer available. In Tablet 1, line 147, Marduk states, "I made those Umanu go down to the Abzu, and I said they were not to come back up." The term Umanu here does not refer to ordinary human craftsmen. It refers to the primordial sages, the beings who established the cult and taught humanity how to properly serve the gods. Marduk sent them down to the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean, the realm of Enki, and he decreed they would not return. Why would Marduk do this? The epic does not provide explicit explanation, but context suggests possibilities. Marduk is consolidating power. He is replacing Enlil as supreme executive god. He is taking over functions previously performed by others. The removal of Enki's sages could be part of this power shift. If the old specialists are gone, new specialists loyal to Marduk must be trained. The change in divine hierarchy requires change in human institutions. But the decision has consequences. Later in the same tablet, line 162, Marduk asks, "Where are the 7 Apkallu of the Abzu, the holy carp, who are perfect in lofty wisdom like Ea their lord, who can make my body holy? They are gone because he sent them away. Now he needs them, and they are unavailable." The knowledge required to properly maintain his cult statue exists only with the Apkallu, and the Apkallu have descended to the realm they came from. The circle is closed. The sages who emerged from water to teach humanity have returned to water. Their time among humans has ended. This passage is significant for several reasons. First, it confirms the tradition of 7 Apkallu associated with Enki. The number 7 appears consistently across sources. Second, it describes them as holy carp, fish from the Abzu. This aligns with Berossus' description of Oannes as fish-bodied and with iconographic representations of fishmen. Third, it emphasizes their wisdom. They are perfect in lofty wisdom like Ea their lord. They possess knowledge equal to the god who sent them. Fourth, it specifies their function, making the god's body holy. They know the rituals of purification and consecration necessary for maintaining divine cult. The era epic thus provides mythological explanation for a transition the Mesopotamians observed in their own history. At some point, the direct connection to primordial knowledge weakened. The specialists who possessed certain skills died without adequately training successors. Techniques were lost. Rituals became corrupted. The purity of the original revelation became diluted. This is cultural decline, but the epic frames it theologically. The sages departed because divine politics required their removal. Other texts approach the transition differently. The BTM Siri ritual, as discussed, lists 7 pure Apkallu followed by 4 post-flood sages of human descent. The Uruk list of kings and sages structures its genealogy to show Umanu claiming lineage from Apkallu, but not being Apkallu themselves. The catalogue of texts and authors attributes the oldest texts to Ea's mouth and Adapa's hand, while later texts are attributed to post-flood human scholars. All these sources describe the same phenomenon: original revelation by non-human or semi-divine teachers, followed by human transmission of that revelation. The transition is not presented as improvement, it is presented as loss mitigated by preservation. The Apkallu possess complete knowledge, the Umanu possess partial knowledge plus commitment to maintaining what they received. The Umanu cannot innovate in the sense of creating genuinely new knowledge. They can only elaborate, combine, and apply what the Apkallu originally taught. This understanding shaped Mesopotamian intellectual culture profoundly. The concept of intellectual property did not exist as we understand it. A scholar did not claim credit for his ideas. He claimed fidelity to ancient tradition. The most authoritative texts were those attributed to the earliest sources. Ashurbanipal boasted not of his own insights, but of his ability to read inscriptions from before the flood. The farther back a text could be traced, the more weight it carried. This also meant the scholarly class functioned as priesthood of inherited wisdom. They were initiated into mysteries. They learned secret formulas. They memorized ritual procedures. They copied tablets with meticulous care because errors meant corruption of sacred knowledge. The chain of transmission from Apkallu to Umanu to student had to remain unbroken. Break the chain, lose the knowledge. In Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods, approximately 911 to 539 BC, the scholarly class formed a closed social group. Positions were hereditary. Sons became scribes because their fathers were scribes. Families controlled specific temples and archives. Knowledge stayed within lineages. This was not corruption or nepotism by their understanding. It was necessary protection. The secrets of Ea must be guarded. They must not fall into improper hands. They must be transmitted only to those properly trained and properly authorized. The king himself required access to this knowledge. He needed diviners to read omens. He needed physicians to maintain his health. He needed exorcists to protect him from demons. He needed astrologers to interpret celestial signs. These specialists formed the king's inner circle. They had direct access. They could write to the king. They could advise him on military campaigns, building projects, diplomatic decisions. Their advice carried weight because they represented the lineage stretching back to the Apkallu. Some Umanu achieved such status that they were included in king lists. They were not kings, but they were listed alongside kings because their knowledge made them essential to royal power. The Uruk list of kings and sages documents this practice. A sage could be memorialized as equal in importance to the ruler he served. This reflected Mesopotamian understanding that knowledge is a form of kingship. The one who knows holds power. But even the most respected Umanu understood themselves as inferior to the original Apkallu. They were students of students of students, many generations removed from the source. They preserved what they could. They transmitted what they received. But the direct connection was severed. The Apkallu had descended to the Abzu. They would not return. The age of unmediated divine instruction was over. Why did the Apkallu descend? The texts provide various answers. Marduk sent them away. The flood ended their mission. They completed their task of establishing civilization and withdrew. They returned to Enki's realm because that is where they belong. Their function was temporary. They were teachers, not permanent residents. All these explanations point to the same conclusion. The Apkallu were transitional figures, intermediaries. They came from the divine realm. They operated in the human realm. They taught what needed to be taught. Then they departed, leaving behind texts and trained students and the structure of knowledge they had established. This makes them unique in ancient Near Eastern mythology. Gods descended to earth in many cultures. heroes ascended to heaven. But divine teachers who came specifically to instruct humanity in systematic knowledge, who established multiple disciplines, who wrote down their teaching, and who then withdrew, leaving humans to maintain the tradition, this pattern is distinctively Mesopotamian, and it is centred on the Apkallu. Their descent to the Abzu is not death, it is return. They go back where they came from. Berossus describes Oannes returning to the sea each night, then emerging again the next day to continue teaching. The boundary between water and land, between divine and human realms, remained permeable during the Antediluvian age. The Apkallu could cross it. After the flood, after Marduk's decree, after the transition to human-only scholarship, the boundary closed. The Abzu became inaccessible except through ritual invocation. The Apkallu remained present in image and text, but not in body. This theological structure explains why Mesopotamian civilization developed such sophisticated mechanisms for preserving and transmitting knowledge. Libraries, scribal schools, standardized curricula, careful copying procedures. All of this infrastructure serves one purpose: maintaining connection to the original revelation. The Apkallu are gone, the direct link is severed, but the texts remain. And if the texts are preserved with sufficient care, if the students are trained with sufficient rigour, if the formulas are copied with sufficient accuracy, then the knowledge survives. Diminished, perhaps, incomplete, certainly, but functional, enough to maintain civilization, enough to serve the gods, enough to remember. When the sages descended, they left behind a tradition. That tradition lasted 3,000 years. It shaped empires. It influenced surrounding cultures. It created the foundation for later scientific and mathematical development in Greek and Islamic civilizations. The knowledge the Apkallu allegedly taught, whether invented by humans or genuinely revealed, proved robust enough to survive multiple conquests, multiple language shifts, multiple religious transformations. And at the centre of that survival was the belief that the knowledge came from outside, that it was gift, not achievement, that it was inherited, not discovered, that it must be preserved because it cannot be recreated. The Apkallu descended, but what they established remained. The question is not whether Mesopotamians believed the Apkallu existed. They did. The question is whether the Apkallu actually existed, or whether they are mythological personifications of the human process by which knowledge accumulates and cultures develop complexity. The texts say they existed. They descended, they taught, they returned to the Abzu, and humanity has been working from their legacy ever since, the heirs of hidden wisdom. After the Apkallu descended, the Umanu emerged. These were human scholars, scribes, diviners, physicians, exorcists, astronomers. They did not claim to be divine or semi-divine. They were mortal. They trained in schools. They copied texts. They passed knowledge to students. But they understood themselves as heirs of the Apkallu tradition. They were guardians of inherited wisdom, maintaining what the original seven had established. The term Umanu carries specific connotations in Mesopotamian administrative texts. It refers to experts, master craftsmen, skilled specialists. In letters from the Neo-Assyrian royal court, Umanu designates the small group of scholars who advised the king directly. These were not ordinary scribes. They were the intellectual elite, the ones who understood the secret law, the ones who could read signs and perform rituals and interpret omens. Perhaps 16 Umanu formed the inner circle during Ashurbanipal's reign. Only these few could correspond regularly with the king. Only they had access to restricted knowledge. Only they were trained in the full range of disciplines attributed to the Apkallu. They were a scholarly elite, and their status was hereditary. Families controlled these positions across generations. Knowledge passed from father to son. The chain of transmission remained within bloodlines. This was not merely social privilege, it was theological necessity. The Umanu held dangerous knowledge, the words of power, the formulas of magic. the techniques of divination. If this knowledge spread beyond the controlled circle, it could be misused. Incompetent practitioners could harm themselves and others. Malicious practitioners could perform witchcraft. The restriction of knowledge to trained specialists protected society from magical chaos. The catalogue of texts and authors, compiled in Ashurbanipal's library, provides the ideological foundation for this system. The catalogue lists major categories of Mesopotamian learning and attributes them to specific sources. The oldest texts come from the mouth of Ea and were written down by Adapa. Slightly later texts are attributed to other antediluvian sages. Post-flood texts are attributed to famous Umanu from historical periods. The structure is clear. Divine revelation transmitted through Apkallu, preserved by Umanu. This was not merely historical claim, it was political claim. The Umanu derived authority from their connection to primordial sources. When they performed a ritual, they acted as representatives of Adapa. When they read an omen, they applied formulas Ea originally revealed. When they advised the king, they spoke from knowledge that predated human civilization itself. This gave them power, not military or economic power, but intellectual and spiritual power. And in Mesopotamian society, that power mattered. Kings needed the Umanu. Campaigns could not be launched without favourable omens. Buildings could not be constructed without proper foundation rituals. Illnesses could not be treated without diagnosis from trained physicians. The king, despite his political authority, depended on specialists who controlled knowledge he did not possess. This created balance. The king commanded armies. The Umanu commanded secrets. Neither could function fully without the other. Ashurbanipal understood this. His inscriptions emphasize his own scholarly training. He learnt to read Sumerian and Akkadian. He studied difficult texts. He mastered astronomical calculation. He understood oil divination. He could participate in technical discussions with the Umanu on equal terms. This was not typical for Mesopotamian kings. Most rulers left scholarship to specialists. Ashurbanipal insisted on direct access to the tradition. One inscription states, "I have learnt the art of the Apkallu, Adapa, so that now I am familiar with the secret storehouse of all scribal learning." He claims initiation into the same knowledge the first sage possessed. Whether this claim was literally true or merely raw propaganda, it demonstrates how the Apkallu tradition functioned as the ultimate source of scholarly legitimacy. To know what Adapa knew was to possess the highest level of human wisdom. The phrase secret storehouse is significant. Knowledge in this system is not something to be shared widely. It is treasure to be guarded. The storehouse has walls. It has doors. Access is controlled. Only the properly trained, only the properly initiated, only those who have demonstrated fidelity to the tradition may enter. Inside the storehouse, tablets, formulas, rituals, names, techniques, the accumulated wisdom transmitted from the Apkallu to their human successors. This created a paradox. The Umanu were essential to maintaining civilization, but they also formed an exclusive class. They held knowledge that gave them power, but they could not share that knowledge without diluting their power. They were guardians, but guardians must prevent entry as much as they preserve content. The result was a system that successfully transmitted complex knowledge across centuries, but that also restricted innovation and created barriers to access. Not everyone could become an Umanu. Literacy itself was restricted. Perhaps 1% of the population could read and write. Of those, only a small fraction received training in the advanced disciplines. Of those, only a few gained access to the restricted texts. The pyramid narrowed. At the top, the scholars who corresponded with the king. At the base, the vast majority relied entirely on oral tradition and practical experience. This structure mirrors what the texts say about the Apkallu. They taught kings. They established the first cities. They instructed the elite who would maintain temples and govern populations. But they did not teach everyone everything. Knowledge was strategic. It was given to those who needed it for their function. The farmer needed agriculture. The king needed divination. The priest needed ritual. Each received what their role required. The complete system belonged only to the Apkallu themselves, and by extension to the Umanu who claimed their lineage. The letters that survive from Neo-Assyrian scholars to their kings show this dynamic in action. The scholar reports an omen. He interprets it. He recommends action. The recommendation is not merely personal opinion. It is based on ancient formulas. The scholar cites precedent. He references tablets. He grounds his interpretation in the revealed tradition. The king must decide whether to follow the advice, but the advice itself carries the weight of primordial authority. Sometimes the Umanu disagreed with each other. Different scholars interpreted the same omen differently. When this happened, the king had to choose which interpretation to accept. But even in disagreement, the scholars argued from the same source. They both appealed to the tradition. They both claimed fidelity to the original revelation. The dispute was not about whether the revelation existed, but about how to apply it in a specific situation. This indicates the tradition was flexible enough to allow interpretation, but rigid enough to maintain coherence. The texts provided framework. The Umanu applied framework to circumstances. Innovation happened at the level of application, not at the level of principle. The principles came from the Apkallu. The applications came from human reasoning working within parameters established long ago. How effective was this system? By one measure, extremely effective. Mesopotamian civilization maintained continuity for 3,000 years. Empires rose and fell, languages changed, gods were renamed, but the scribal tradition persisted. Tablets from the old Babylonian period were still being copied in the Neo-Assyrian period over 1,000 years later. The knowledge was preserved. The chain of transmission held. By another measure, the system had weaknesses. It did not encourage innovation. It did not expand access. It created barriers between the learned and the common people. When the system finally collapsed, with the fall of Babylon to Persia and the subsequent Hellenization of the Near East, much of the knowledge was lost. The Umanu could not maintain their tradition once the institutional structures supporting them dissolved. The tablets survived, but the living tradition of reading them eventually died. For 2,000 years, Cuneiform was an unreadable script. The knowledge it contained was inaccessible until modern archaeology and linguistics recovered it. Yet even in collapse, the system demonstrated remarkable resilience. Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BC, still knew the tradition. He still transmitted the story of Oannes and the teaching of civilization. Later writers preserved fragments of his work. Greek and Roman authors referred to Mesopotamian wisdom. Elements of the tradition influenced early Christianity, Judaism and Islam. The Apkallu became the watchers in Jewish apocalyptic literature. The concept of antediluvian revelation persisted even as the specific Mesopotamian context faded. The Umanu, as guardians of hidden wisdom, successfully transmitted a cultural memory for as long as the institutional framework existed. When that framework collapsed, the memory diffused into other traditions. The specific names and specific formulas were lost, but the pattern remained. Wisdom comes from ancient sources. Knowledge is inherited. Teachers in the distant past gave humanity the tools of civilization. This pattern persists in multiple cultures, suggesting the Mesopotamian version resonates with something universally human, or perhaps preserves something universally true. The heirs of the Apkallu understood themselves as links in a chain. They were not the source. They were conduits. They transmitted what they received. They trained students to do the same. The chain extended backward to the first sage who wrote down what Ea dictated. It extended forward to every student who learned the formulas and maintained the tradition. As long as the chain held, the knowledge survived. When the chain broke, the knowledge fragmented. Today, the tablets sit in museums. Scholars translate them. Historians analyse them. But the living tradition of Umanu maintaining Apkallu wisdom is gone. What remains is record, and the record insists, across thousands of tablets and hundreds of years, that the wisdom civilization depends upon came originally from 7 sages sent by Enki before the flood. The Umanu preserved it. We excavate it. But neither preservation nor excavation recreates the original revelation. Whether that revelation ever occurred is the question we cannot answer from the evidence available. We know the Mesopotamians believed it occurred. We know they structured their entire intellectual culture around that belief. We know they successfully maintained complex knowledge systems for millennia. What we do not know is whether those systems originated in divine teaching or in human invention mythologically attributed to divine teaching. The Umanu would say divine teaching. Modern scholarship says human invention. The texts make their claim. The heirs of hidden wisdom preserve that claim. And now we read the preservation, wondering what it preserves. Patterns across the silence. Now the evidence has been presented. Tablets, reliefs, ritual texts, king lists, mythological narratives, all describing from multiple angles and multiple time periods the same core tradition. 7 sages, sent by Enki, teaching civilization before the flood, then withdrawing, then being remembered, invoked, represented, preserved by human scholars who understood themselves as maintaining inherited wisdom. The question is interpretation. What does all this evidence mean? 3 major possibilities present themselves, and honest engagement requires presenting all 3 fairly. First interpretation, pure mythology. The Apkallu never existed as actual beings. They are personifications. The development of writing might be personified as a dapper receiving wisdom from E. The invention of agriculture might be mythologized as a sage teaching seed planting. Each major advance in cultural complexity gets represented as instruction from a divine teacher. This makes psychological sense. It is easier to accept new practices if they come with divine authority than if they appear as human innovation. The Mesopotamians created the Apkallu tradition to explain their own cultural development in theological terms. This interpretation has strengths. It aligns with how modern scholars understand myth. It does not require accepting supernatural claims. It explains the evidence as cultural product rather than historical record. The flood marks a real or perceived break in cultural continuity. The Apkallu tradition explains that break and provides framework for rebuilding. The tradition is true in the sense that it meaningfully organizes Mesopotamian self-understanding, but not true in the sense that the Apkallu actually existed. Counter-evidence, the tradition is remarkably consistent across time and place. Stories that are purely invented tend to vary more. The names stay the same. The sequence stays the same. The association with specific cities stays the same. This suggests either very early standardization or preservation of actual memory. Also, the Mesopotamians did not create similar origin myths for other cultural developments. Why personify the origins of civilization, but not the origins of pottery or metallurgy or other innovations? Second interpretation, encoded wisdom tradition. The Apkallu represent a real historical phenomenon, but not in literal terms. There was a period of cultural transmission, possibly from a more advanced neighbouring culture or from an earlier civilization whose identity has been lost. This transmission involved systematic teaching. Knowledge was organised into disciplines. Specialists emerged. The 7 sages might be 7 schools of thought, or 7 categories of knowledge, or 7 periods of instruction. The tradition encodes historical memory of receiving civilization rather than inventing it, but expresses that memory through mythological language because that was the available framework. This interpretation has strengths. It takes the tradition seriously without requiring supernatural explanation. It explains why the Mesopotamians insisted knowledge came from outside. It suggests cultural contact and knowledge transfer as the historical reality behind the mythological expression. The fishmen might represent foreigners who arrived by sea. The association with water might indicate maritime origin. The teaching before the flood might mark genuine prehistoric period when knowledge was transmitted, followed by a catastrophe that required rebuilding. Counter-evidence: if the Apkallu represent foreign teachers, why are they so thoroughly integrated into Mesopotamian theology? They come from Enki, who is unambiguously Mesopotamian. They teach in Mesopotamian cities. They serve Mesopotamian kings. There is no indication they came from elsewhere. Also, if they represent categories of knowledge rather than individuals, why give them personal names and biographical details? The encoding would need to be remarkably sophisticated to generate the specific details preserved across sources. Third interpretation: historical documentation. The Apkallu were actual beings who taught actual knowledge. The texts are records, not mythology. Something happened in prehistoric Mesopotamia. Teachers came. They established systematic knowledge. They were understood as intermediary beings, neither fully divine nor fully human. They operated for a period, then withdrew. The flood was a real catastrophe. Knowledge was preserved through it. The post-flood civilization rebuilt using that preserved knowledge. The Mesopotamians remembered this sequence and transmitted it faithfully across thousands of years. This interpretation has strengths. It takes the texts at face value. It explains their consistency. It accounts for the Mesopotamian insistence that knowledge was revealed rather than discovered. It suggests the rapid development of complex culture in Mesopotamia reflects actual knowledge transmission rather than independent invention. The Antediluvian period corresponds to real prehistoric time. The flood corresponds to real environmental catastrophe or catastrophes. The tradition is memory. Counter-evidence: this requires accepting that non-human or semi-divine beings actually existed and functioned in human society. Modern materialist worldview makes this nearly impossible to accept. If the Apkallu were physical beings, they would leave physical evidence. No skeletons of fishmen have been found. No artifacts demonstrably created by non-human intelligence have been identified. The interpretation requires either supernatural framework or unknown lost technology. Both are problematic from modern scientific perspective. What does the evidence support? All three interpretations can explain the evidence. That is the problem. Pure mythology explains it as cultural product. Encoded wisdom explains it as historical memory mythologically expressed. Historical documentation explains it as accurate record. Each interpretation makes the evidence coherent. Each has strengths and weaknesses. None can be definitively proven or disproven from the tablets alone. Perhaps the question needs reframing. Instead of asking which interpretation is true, ask what does each interpretation imply. Pure mythology implies humans generated all their knowledge through trial and error and mythologized that process for theological reasons. Encoded wisdom implies knowledge transmission occurred, but the source and mechanism are obscured by mythological expression. Historical documentation implies non-human, or at least anomalous human teachers, existed and established civilization. Modern scholarship defaults to pure mythology, not because evidence demands it, but because worldview requires it. If we begin from the premise that supernatural or non-human entities do not exist and cannot exist, then the Apkallu must be invented regardless of how the texts present them. The interpretation is predetermined by metaphysical assumption, but assumptions can be questioned. The Mesopotamians, working from different premises, arrived at different conclusions. They experienced reality as containing more than material cause and effect. They understood divine and human realms as interactive. They believed knowledge could come from non-human sources. Their framework made the Apkallu plausible. Our framework makes them impossible. But frameworks are interpretive tools, not reality itself. Consider patterns that appear across the evidence. 1. Knowledge is attributed to external source. The Mesopotamians consistently claim they received rather than invented. This could be mythology, or it could be memory. 2. The knowledge is systematic, not random innovations, but organized disciplines. exorcism, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, law, agriculture. This suggests systematic teaching rather than gradual accumulation. 3. The tradition remains stable across centuries. The Apkallu are not reinterpreted or reimagined, they stay the same. This suggests either very early standardization or preservation of actual memory. 4. The tradition is operationalized. The Apkallu are not merely remembered, they are invoked, represented, installed as guardians. This indicates ongoing belief in their reality and effectiveness. 5. The scholarly class structures itself around maintaining the tradition. The Umanu do not claim to innovate, they claim to preserve. Their entire system is designed for transmission of inherited wisdom. These patterns are consistent with either encoded wisdom or historical documentation. They are less consistent with pure mythology. Myths that are purely invented tend to be more fluid. They adapt to changing circumstances. They get embellished and reinterpreted. The Apkallu tradition shows remarkable rigidity. It resists change. It maintains structure. This looks like preservation rather than invention. But preservation of what? That remains unanswerable from the evidence available. We have texts. We have reliefs. We have ritual practices. We have institutional structures. All of this demonstrates the Mesopotamians believed the Apkallu existed and transmitted knowledge. None of it proves the Apkallu actually existed. What we can say, the tradition mattered. It shaped Mesopotamian civilization for 3 millennia. It created frameworks for understanding knowledge, authority, and human relationship to divine sources. It established patterns that influenced subsequent cultures. Whether the Apkallu were real or mythological, their effect was real. The preservation of complex knowledge was real. The transmission across generations was real. The institutional structures maintaining that transmission were real. And the question persists: invented, encoded, or documented? Mythology, wisdom tradition, or historical record? The evidence allows all three. The interpreter must choose based on premises brought to the evidence rather than conclusions derived from it. The Mesopotamians chose historical record. They believed, they preserved, they transmitted. We excavate what they preserved, we translate what they transmitted. We remain uncertain what they believe. The silence between Antediluvian age and post-flood rebuilding is not merely temporal, it is epistemological. We cannot bridge it from this side. The texts reach back toward it. They claim to reach through it. They insist knowledge crossed it. But whether knowledge crossed with human carriers, divine messengers, or mythological personifications, we cannot determine. The pattern exists. 7 sages, 7 cities, 7 domains of knowledge, taught before catastrophe, preserved through catastrophe, transmitted after catastrophe. The pattern is documented. The interpretation remains open. The question the tablets ask: the British Museum vault is quiet now, climate controlled. The tablet still sits where it was placed after cataloguing. The cuneiform signs still sharp. The 7 names still legible: Uana, Uanaduga, Enmaduga, Enmegalama, Enmebuluga, Anenlilda, Utuabzu. The same names someone pressed into wet clay more than 2,000 years ago. The same names the Mesopotamians preserved for thousands of years before that. The tablet makes a claim. These beings existed. They taught. They came from Enki. They established civilization. The claim is simple. The implications are not. If the claim is true in the straightforward sense, if the Apkallu actually existed as beings who taught systematic knowledge before a historical flood, then human civilization did not develop purely through internal innovation. It developed through knowledge transmission from an external source. This changes the story of human history, not in details. The cities were still built. The tablets were still written. The mathematics was still calculated. But the origin shifts. Discovery becomes gift. Innovation becomes elaboration. Progress becomes restoration. If the claim is mythological, if the Apkallu are personifications of cultural development, then the Mesopotamians created a highly sophisticated theological framework to explain their own achievements. This too is significant. It suggests they found it psychologically or socially necessary to attribute their knowledge to divine rather than human sources, perhaps to maintain social stability, perhaps to legitimate the authority of the scribal class, perhaps because attributing innovation to humans seemed like dangerous pride. The mythology itself becomes evidence of how cultures organise understanding of their own development. If the claim encodes wisdom tradition, if the Apkallu represent historical knowledge transmission expressed through mythological language, then something did happen. Teachers came. Knowledge was systematically organised. The flood disrupted transmission. Recovery followed. The core claim is true, but expressed in the framework available to ancient thinkers who did not distinguish sharply between natural and supernatural, between physical and spiritual, between historical and theological. All three possibilities matter. None can be ruled out from the evidence. What remains is not certainty, but question. And the question is not merely academic. It touches the nature of knowledge itself. Where does knowledge come from? How is it preserved? What is lost when transmission fails? The Mesopotamians understood knowledge as fragile. It must be guarded. It must be copied carefully. It must be transmitted with discipline. Break the chain, lose the knowledge. This understanding shaped their culture for 3,000 years. It created institutions designed for preservation. It trained specialists in maintenance and transmission. It valued fidelity over innovation. Modern culture understands knowledge differently. Knowledge is expansive. It grows through experimentation. It is validated through replication. Innovation is celebrated. Disruption is valued. The past is useful only as foundation for moving beyond it. Preservation matters less than discovery. Which understanding serves humanity better? The Mesopotamian approach preserved complex knowledge systems across millennia. The modern approach generates new knowledge rapidly. The Mesopotamian approach restricted access and limited innovation. The modern approach democratizes knowledge and encourages creativity. Both have strengths. Both have costs. Neither is obviously superior in all contexts, but the Mesopotamian approach arose from specific premise. Knowledge came from outside. It was given. It must be maintained. If that premise is false, if knowledge is purely human achievement, then the preservation impulse was misguided. Better to innovate than to preserve. Better to create new knowledge than to maintain old knowledge. If that premise is true, if knowledge was transmitted from external source, then the preservation impulse was essential. The knowledge might be lost without institutional commitment to maintaining it. Innovation is valuable, but only if the foundation remains intact. Break connection with original transmission, and recovery becomes difficult or impossible. The Apkallu tradition suggests the Mesopotamians chose preservation because they understood themselves as working from revealed rather than discovered knowledge. They were not the source, they were the recipients. And recipients have responsibility to maintain what they received, to transmit it to the next generation, to ensure the chain holds. Whether the revelation actually occurred is less important in practical terms than the fact that believing it occurred shaped behaviour. The belief created infrastructure, libraries, scribal schools, training programs, quality control for copying tablets, all designed to preserve, and the preservation succeeded. We have the tablets, we can read them, we can analyse what they preserved. What they preserved is the claim. 7 sages, sent by Enki, teaching before the flood, withdrawing afterward, leaving humanity with texts, traditions, and responsibility to maintain what was given. The claim is consistent. It is documented. It is central to how the Mesopotamians understood themselves. And the claim poses a question to everyone who encounters it. Are we inventors or inheritors? Is civilization achievement or gift? Is knowledge discovered or transmitted? The modern default is invention, achievement, discovery. The Mesopotamian insistence is inheritance, gift, transmission. One says we create, one says we receive and maintain. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps civilization requires both innovation and preservation. Perhaps knowledge is both discovered through human effort and received from sources outside individual human consciousness. Perhaps the truth is more complex than either pure mythology or pure historical documentation can capture. The tablet sits in the vault. The names remain legible. The claim persists. 7 sages taught humanity. The texts say so. Thousands of years of Mesopotamian culture said so. Whether that means 7 actual beings, or 7 categories of knowledge, or 7 mythological personifications, or something else entirely, the pattern exists. And the pattern shaped history. We come to the evidence with our questions. Did this happen? Is it true? Can we prove it? Can we dismiss it? We want certainty. We want resolution. The evidence does not provide it. The evidence provides only the texts and the tradition and the consistency in the claim. So we are left where the Mesopotamians were left when the Apkallu descended, with texts, with formulas, with systems, with knowledge that works, regardless of whether we can explain where it came from or validate the story of its origins. We can use what was preserved. We can elaborate it. We can combine it in new ways. But we cannot recreate the original transmission, if there was one. We cannot verify the source, if there was one. We can only read what was written and decide what it means. The British Museum vault is quiet. The tablet is cool to the touch. The signs are clear. Oannes, who completed the plans of heaven and earth. First of 7. Teacher of humanity. Servant of Enki. Either actual being, or symbolic representation, or mythological personification, or encoded historical memory. The text does not specify. It simply states, this one came, this one taught, this one established order, this one returned to water. And Berossus's words echo across the silence. From that time, nothing further has been discovered. All subsequent knowledge elaboration of what was given at the beginning. Innovation is recombination, discovery is recovery, progress is restoration of what was nearly lost. Whether this is true depends on what the Apkallu were, and what they were depends on interpretation we bring to the evidence. The evidence does not interpret itself. It waits. The tablets wait. The names wait. The question waits. 7 sages came from water. They taught civilization. They returned to water. Humanity has been working from that teaching ever since. Mesopotamia believed this for 3,000 years. The texts document the belief. The texts survive in museums. The question survives with them, not answered, not resolved, but preserved. Just as the Apkallu taught, knowledge must be preserved, passed to the next generation, maintained across time. Whether the knowledge is historical fact, theological truth, or mythological wisdom, the preservation itself matters. Break the transmission, lose the knowledge. The transmission has not broken. We have the tablets. We can read them. They tell us about 7 sages sent by Enki to civilize mankind. They tell us this consistently, clearly, persistently across centuries. What we do with that testimony is our choice. Dismiss it as superstition, analyze it as cultural product, consider it as encoded historical memory, accept it as documented history. Each choice has implications. Each shapes how we understand civilization, knowledge, and human origins. The Mesopotamians made their choice. They believed. They preserved. They transmitted. The tablets remain as evidence of their commitment, and as question for anyone who reads them. Where does civilization come from? Who taught humanity to write, to calculate, to heal, to read the heavens, to organize society? Did we figure it out alone, or were we taught? The tablets ask. The silence between antediluvian age and post-flood rebuilding does not answer. The question remains, as the scribes intended, as the tradition requires, as the Apkallu, whether actual or mythological, established. Preserve the question, pass it forward, let each generation decide. The vault is quiet, the clay is cool, the names are clear. 7 sages, Enki sent them, they taught humanity. The rest is interpretation. And interpretation, unlike the names pressed into clay, changes with each reader who encounters the text. Sleep now, if you will. The tablets will be there tomorrow. The question will remain. The Apkallu, whatever they were, have done their work. They taught. We preserve what they taught. We pass it forward. The chain continues. as long as someone reads the names, as long as someone asks the question, as long as someone wonders. 7 sages, 7 cities, 7 domains of knowledge, given before the waters rose, preserved through catastrophe, transmitted to us, still here, still asking, still waiting for answer we may never have. But the question itself is the inheritance, and inheritance, as the Mesopotamians understood, is enough.